So I want to talk about how deterrence worked in the Cold War, but also how the existence of China's arsenal now complicates this. The fact that we haven't fought World War III, or we did not fight World War III with the Soviet Union, seems to be powerful evidence that nuclear weapons had a deterrent effect. Talk about how it actually worked in the Cold War. And then the second part of my question, which we can get right to, is we have now not one, but two, I mean, three if you count North Korea's more limited arsenal, potentially four looming in the future if you count Iran and the potential of their nuclear program. But in particular, Russia and China embarked on this, crash expansion modernization, really more expansion than modernization because so much of the stuff is brand new in the first place. How did it work in the Cold War?
Sure. Well, I'll start with during the Cold War. So after Truman, used the bombs to end World War II, there really was this time in which the United States had to think about, well, now what do we do with these things? And again, I'm being oversimplifying and being kind of crude about it, but we as a country, strategists, military strategists, and policymakers had to then think about how are we gonna use these nuclear weapons now? We actually don't want to make sure that they are weapons that are used commonly in warfare. They seem to be different, and of course they're sort of political weapons with military utility in order to make them credible as political weapons. And so in the Cold War, we really had to kind of grapple with this. You had the Soviet Union that was in this massive arms buildup, and so we had an imperialist power that was surpassing the United States numerically in nuclear weapons, and so we had to think about what do we do with this. And Schlesinger, during the Nixon administration, argued very persuasively in congressional hearings that in order for the United States to successfully increase our chance to deter the Soviet Union, that we should build a nuclear force and adapt the nuclear force and deploy a nuclear force such that we are convincing the Soviets that the United States could put a weapon on targets that the Soviets valued. So we couldn't just think about deterrence sort of in the abstract, how would we behave in these scenarios? You had to really kind of think about what do the Soviets value, and then how do we credibly convince the Soviets that the United States might, in fact, use nuclear weapons in defense of our interests. And so this was the counterforce doctrine, that we would not target Soviet cities in our deterrent strategy, but we would target what the adversary valued, and that's their military, their conventional strategic systems, what their regime needed to stay in power and what the regime needed in order to maintain control over their population, and then their war-supporting industry to reconstitute and build more nuclear weapons. And that kind, Schlesinger argued, of American nuclear posture would be our best bet for convincing the Soviets not to use a nuclear weapon. That if the United States disarmed or shrank our force or only had a handful of weapons, that would not be credible against the Soviets. And that really, it won the day, and that argument. And so we've maintained a nuclear force that has a counterforce strategy, targeting strategy since then. So then you had Democrat administrations, Republican administrations, and it's maintained its bipartisan, really nonpartisan logic behind it. To your question about how this is different now with China, we, the United States, have only ever had to deter one major nuclear power, the Soviet Union. And this is really unprecedented in history, that now the United States has to size our force, constitute our force, such that we are credibly deterring not just one major nuclear power, but two in the People's Republic of China. And the North Korea problem is a little bit different because we wouldn't need the same kind of size and force to deter North Korea, because it has far fewer weapons. And we have a different policy, official policy, where if the North Koreans were to use a nuclear weapon against the United States, we would end the regime. That's the official policy.